"Don't embarrass me," Daniel Harmon whispered to his wife as they dressed for the gala. "Long sleeves. Nothing that shows the scars." He had already hired the lawyers. He was already planning to throw her out. But that night everything he had spent 10 years building was going to come apart because of her. The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut before Daniel's expression changed. A second ago he had been all warm handshakes and easy smiles, walking the Alcott Capital courier out like an old friend. The moment the latch caught, that version of him was gone. He crossed to the kitchen island, picked up the white linen napkin folded beside the coffee tray, and began rubbing the handle of the porcelain cup, the one Claire had carried out and set down in front of the courier, with both hands. He scrubbed it the way you clean something that has been contaminated. He didn't look at her while he talked. He rarely did. He said he had spent years building his name in this city, that he had breakfast with aldermen and sat across from board members at tables that took a decade to earn a seat at, and that she managed to undo all of it just by walking into a room. The courier had stared at her wrists. He had seen it. He asked her why she had come downstairs at all. Claire stood at the far end of the island with her hands at her sides. She didn't answer. She had learned a long time ago that anything she said only gave him more to work with. Daniel dropped the napkin on the tray and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out his gold Amex and slid it across the marble. It traveled the full length of the island and stopped at the edge. "Tonight was Alcott Capital's 15th anniversary gala at the Palmer House," he said. Robert Alcott himself had made it mandatory, all senior staff, wives included. That was the only reason she was coming. She would go to the mall, buy a dress, black long sleeves, high neck, nothing that showed her wrists. At the gala she would stay away from the main tables, she would not start conversations, and if anyone asked who she was, she would say she had a headache and leave it at that. She was not to embarrass him in front of people who mattered. His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, picked it up fast, and rejected the call. Then he looked over at Claire, checking whether she had seen the name. She was looking at the window. He straightened his tie, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out. The front door closed behind him with the same clean, controlled sound as always. Claire stood in the kitchen alone. The coffee tray was still on the island. The napkin was crumpled next to the cup he had cleaned. Some people spend years mistaking someone's silence for surrender. Daniel made that mistake every single day. She picked up the Amex, turned it once in her fingers, and walked upstairs past the master bedroom all the way to the room at the end of the hall. The master bedroom door was open as she passed it. She didn't slow down. Her room was the last one on the hall, the one Daniel referred to as the storage room when he mentioned it at all, which wasn't often. It had been framed that way from the beginning, a space that didn't quite make the cut for anything real. Narrow bed against one wall, a plain wood desk under the single window, a closet with a broken overhead light she had fixed herself. Daniel had never stepped inside it. As far as he was concerned, she spent her days in here, cycling through free coupon forums and discount retail sites, which suited her perfectly. She closed the door, sat down at the desk, and opened the laptop. It was old and scratched and looked exactly like something that didn't matter. The moment her fingers hit the key, something in her posture shifted. The careful stillness she carried downstairs, the version of herself she wore around Daniel, came off like a coat. Her shoulders settled differently. Her eyes sharpened. The screen loaded a secure financial management portal, multi-layer authentication, the kind of back-end architecture that cost real money to build and more to maintain. This was the operational infrastructure of Wings of Hope Foundation, a Chicago-based tax-exempt charity that had funded more than 500 pediatric cardiac surgeries over the past 6 years, moving millions of dollars through donor channels, international clinical partnerships, and surgical referral networks that Claire had built contact by contact, mostly between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. The public face of Wings of Hope was Renee Caldwell. Renee's name was on every IRS filing, every press release, every quote in every Chicago Tribune article about the foundation's work. Renee was the one who attended the donor luncheons and answered the journalist calls and stood in front of the cameras. She was also Claire's oldest friend, and she had agreed to carry the public role for one specific reason: Claire could not be the face of anything. A federal wire fraud conviction does not disappear from a background check. And beyond the legal record, there was a more immediate problem. If Daniel ever discovered what kind of money moved through Claire's hands every year, he would find a way to get to it. For Daniel, there were no sacred things. There was only leverage. A notification appeared in the encrypted messaging app in the bottom corner of the screen. Renee. The wire had cleared to Munich that morning. Charlie's surgery was confirmed for tomorrow. They had made it. Claire exhaled slowly. She had been watching that transfer for 72 hours. Charlie was 5 years old, the grandson of Robert and Margaret Alcott, and he had a congenital heart defect complex enough that every cardiologist at Lurie Children's had eventually said the same thing. The Munich clinic had agreed to take his case. Getting him there had required a medical transport flight, and the logistics of covering that cost at short notice had kept Claire up for 3 nights running. A second message came through a moment later. The typing indicator had paused several times before the words appeared the way it does when someone is deciding how to say something. Renee wrote, "Tonight is the National Pediatric Charity Awards. Palmer House. Same hotel as Daniel's Gala, they share the convention space. We have been nominated. The organizers want the founder present. Claire, it is time. Are you ready to stop hiding, Claire? Read it twice." She thought about Daniel's voice in the kitchen that morning. She thought about the napkin. She thought about the dress she was about to go buy. Then she typed, "I will be there. For the kids." She had been running one of the most important children's charities in the country from a room her husband used as a punchline. She closed the laptop, picked up the Amex from where she had set it on the desk, and went to get her coat. She needed the dress first. And before tonight, she needed to find somewhere to get her hair done. The dress took 20 minutes. Black, long-sleeved, high-necked, exactly what Daniel had specified, the kind of dress designed to make a person disappear into the background of a room. Claire paid with the Amex, folded the receipt into her coat pocket, and carried the paper bag out of the store with her arms straight down at her side. It was heavier than it had any right to be. She had a few hours before the car came at 6. The upper level of the mall had a row of salons, the kind where the consultation alone ran $80, and the women waiting in the chairs were the same women who would be at the Palmer House that evening. Claire took the escalator down instead. The lower level smelled like the dry cleaner and the soft rubber of the shoe repair shop next door. At the far end, between a cell phone case kiosk and a Subway, was a small barbershop with a hand-lettered sign and 2 chairs visible through the glass. She pushed the door open. The floor was scuffed linoleum. The mirrors were clean. The whole place smelled faintly of green apple shampoo, and a small radio on the back shelf was playing something quiet enough that you could ignore it. The stylist was a young woman named Brianna, 21 at most, with a name tag and large unhurried eyes, who looked up from the front desk and smiled like Claire had made her day by walking in. Brianna washed her hair at the sink the way people wash hair when they actually care about the person in the chair. She checked the water temperature against her wrist before she let it touch Claire's head. Her fingers worked through the roots without pulling. Claire closed her eyes. She had not realized until that moment how long it had been since someone had touched her without impatience underneath it. Daniel had stopped making physical contact years ago, not dramatically, not with an announcement, just a slow withdrawal until the distance became the normal thing. And then she had stopped noticing the absence because noticing it was too expensive. She was still sitting with her eyes closed when the door to the salon opened hard enough to bounce off the wall stop. 3 women came in together, loud with the particular irritation of people whose plans had been disrupted. Fur coats, designer bags, the kind of shoes that required a car to the front door. Diane Schiff was in the middle, Warren Schiff's wife, a face Claire recognized from the Alcott Capitol holiday events she had been brought to twice when optics required it. A pipe had burst in the upstairs salon, apparently right in the middle of someone's highlights. They needed blowouts, and they needed them in the next 2 hours. Brianna blinked twice, then started setting up stations. The 3 women settled into the chairs on either side of Claire without looking at her once. She was in a gray cape with her hair damp and her face bare. She did not look like anyone worth registering. Their conversation picked up where it had apparently left off in the elevator. Daniel Harmon's name came up within the first 2 minutes. Diane said it the way people say the name of someone they find mildly entertaining, with that light edge of condescension that requires an audience. Tonight Daniel had to bring his wife to the Palmer House, she said. The wife who did federal time. Wire fraud, supposedly, though she had heard the woman was barely literate about anything financial, which meant she either took the fall for someone or was dumber than she looked. Either way, she had spent time in a federal prison, and now she was going to show up at one of the biggest corporate events of the year. Diane's friend said she would probably come in something from the clearance rack and stand by the restrooms all night. The 3rd woman laughed. Then Diane said, after the merger closes, it is done. The divorce paperwork was already with the lawyers. Daniel was filing as soon as the ink dried on the Alcott contract. Jade Pryor was moving in. It was settled, had been settled for months, and everyone at the company knew it except apparently the wife, who was probably too out of touch to have figured it out yet. Brianna had stopped using the blow dryer. Claire had not moved. But something in the line of her back had changed, not a flinch, not a reaction, just a stillness that went a degree deeper than before. Brianna set the dryer down on the station, reached forward, and placed one hand gently on Claire's shoulder. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The door opened again. This time the bell above it rang softly. A woman came in, a lone cashmere coat, silver hair smoothed back, the kind of posture that does not come from reminding yourself to stand straight. She took in the room without appearing to look at anything in particular, and when her eyes moved across Diane and her friend, something in the temperature shifted. Diane straightened almost imperceptibly. The woman's name was Margaret Alcott. She sat in the waiting chair near the door, still in her coat, and said she had been directed downstairs by the front desk. Then she said, without any particular build-up, that she had overheard part of the conversation on her way in. She looked at Diane. She said that she had lived long enough to know the difference between women who had actually done something with their lives and women who discussed other people's clothing choices as a substitute for having opinions worth holding. She said it without raising her voice. Diane opened her mouth once and closed it again. Then Margaret's voice changed slightly, not softer exactly, but more interior, the way people sound when they are speaking about something that still sits close to them. She said that there was a foundation called Wings of Hope, that most people had heard of it in the abstract, the numbers, the statistics, the awards. That what most people did not know was what it looked like from the inside when you were the family. Her grandson Charlie had a heart defect that every cardiologist in Chicago had eventually said the same thing about. The foundation had organized his surgery in Munich. When the family's accounts were frozen by a banking hold, a bureaucratic error, the kind that takes weeks to untangle, the foundation had covered the transport costs out of its own reserves. The woman who ran it had sold a piece of jewelry that had belonged to her mother in order to make the numbers work. Charlie was 5 years old and building things out of Legos, and Margaret thought about that woman every single day without knowing her name. The salon was very quiet. The radio was still playing, but no one was listening to it. Claire sat facing the mirror. Her expression had not changed. Brianna finished the blowout in silence, careful, unhurried, the same as before, and when she was done, Claire's hair fell clean and even against her shoulders. Claire stood, took off the cape, and walked to the front desk. She put several bills on the counter, more than the service cost by a distance that made Brianna start to object. Claire touched her hand once briefly to stop her. She said thank you. She meant it in more directions than one. On her way to the door, she passed Margaret Alcott's chair. She slowed for just a moment and inclined her head, a small deliberate gesture, the kind that means something without explaining itself. Margaret looked up and met her eyes with the polite attention of someone who did not yet know what she was looking at. The woman who had just described Claire as a nobody had no idea she was sitting 3 feet from the person who saved her grandson's life. Claire pushed through the door and walked toward the parking garage with the black dress under her arm and a very clear picture of exactly what the evening was going to be. They arrived at the Palmer house a few minutes past 7. The revolving door released them into the main lobby, chandeliers overhead, a string quartet working through something unobtrusive near the far wall. The warm, compressed smell of expensive perfume and fresh flowers, and a few hundred people who had dressed very carefully for the evening. Daniel had his hand on Claire's arm before they were fully through the door, fingers above the elbow grip, just tight enough to direct without appearing to. He moved her through the lobby at his pace, scanning the room over her head as they walked. When he found what he was looking for, a marble column set back from the main circulation where the light from the chandeliers did not quite reach, he steered her toward it and stopped. He said if anyone asks, she had a headache. No conversations, no introductions. Stay here until he came to get her for dinner. He had already spotted Warren Schiff and a group of board members collecting near the bar, and his attention was already mostly there. He straightened his jacket and walked toward them, and by the time he was 10 feet away, the smile was fully assembled. Claire stood with her back to the column. From where she was positioned, she could see most of the lobby without being in it. She watched the room fill in around her table, assignments being sorted out, old alliances being renewed, loudly younger staff reading the room for where to position themselves. She had been to enough of these evenings to recognize the choreography. Everyone performing the version of themselves that had gotten them into the room and might get them further. Jade arrived about 15 minutes later. The dress was exactly what Diane had described in the salon: red silk open-back custom from a boutique on Oak Street. The kind of thing that required a specific kind of confidence to wear in a room like this. She had the confidence. Daniel saw her from across the lobby and broke off his conversation mid-sentence. He crossed to her without appearing to hurry, which somehow made it more visible. He took her hand. He turned it over and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles. Jade said something close to his ear. He laughed. Then he remembered the evening's requirements, glanced once toward the column, and went to the bar to get champagne. He came back with 2 glasses and handed one to Jade. He did not look in Claire's direction. Jade waited until Daniel was absorbed back into the board member conversation before she walked over. She stopped closer than the conversation required and kept her voice at the register that carries without traveling. She said the divorce paperwork was already signed. Daniel's lawyers were filing in the morning. Claire would be leaving tomorrow with 1 bag, and she should probably start thinking about that now tonight while she still had a quiet moment to process it. Claire looked at her. Not with alarm, not with the wounded expression Jade had clearly been expecting. She took her time. The dress, the jewelry at the throat, the careful performance of arrival. Then she said quietly that she had spent 4 years in a federal facility around people who had done genuinely serious things. And that even the ones who had done the worst of it carried themselves with more dignity than someone who introduced herself by announcing she had taken another woman's husband. She said it without heat. She said it the way you state something that is simply accurate. Jade's mouth opened. Whatever she had prepared for it was not that. Before she could reorganize, Daniel reappeared with the champagne flutes, his voice carrying the forced warmth of a man performing ease. Jade took her glass from him, turned without finishing her sentence, and walked toward the ballroom entrance. Daniel watched her go, then turned a measuring look on Claire. Claire was already looking elsewhere. A few minutes later he was back at her side, hand at her elbow again, steering her toward the dinner service. The senior management table was already filling in. Warren Schiff had claimed the anchor seat and was talking before everyone was seated. The senior management table was set close to the stage, round and large enough for 12, with the kind of floral centerpiece that existed to signal budget rather than taste. Warren Schiff had positioned himself with his back to the room and his voice pointed outward, which was his natural configuration. By the time Claire and Daniel sat down, he was already mid-story about a golf trip that had apparently confirmed several things he already believed about himself. Dinner came out in courses. The conversation moved the way it always did at these tables: deal flow, market positioning, the upcoming merger, who was in line for what after the restructuring. Daniel tracked it carefully, inserting himself at the right intervals, laughing half a beat after the people whose opinions mattered. Claire sat beside him and said nothing. This was expected and unremarkable. Then someone at the far end of the table mentioned the camera crews in the lobby. Network affiliates, apparently 3 of them. Someone else said they were there for a charity awards ceremony happening in the Empire room next door. Warren looked up from his plate. He had opinions about charity. He set down his fork and delivered them with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously questioned in a professional setting. Nonprofit foundations, he said, were the most elegant form of legal money laundering available to the American donor class. Administrative overhead alone consumed 60 cents of every dollar raised. The rest moved offshore through consulting agreements and board compensation, and not a dime of it reached an actual sick child. He said he knew this as a financial professional. He said the camera crews were there because the media liked a good story and none of it was real. Daniel smiled at the table. A few colleagues nodded with the mild agreement of people who did not have a stake in the question either way. Warren picked his fork back up. Claire said that is not accurate. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward or signal that something significant was coming. She said it the way you correct a wrong turn, matter-of-factly, because leaving it uncorrected would be the stranger choice. Warren looked at her. Most of the table looked at her. Daniel's expression shifted in a way he could not fully control. Claire said that for someone in his role, the legal framework here was worth understanding correctly. Organizations like Wings of Hope, the foundation being recognized next door tonight, were required by federal law to file a detailed financial disclosure with the IRS annually, a document publicly accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Independent audits were mandatory. Administrative costs for serious organizations were covered through restricted trustee contributions, specifically so that public donations went entirely to patient services. Not 60 cents on the dollar. 100 cents. She had the previous year's figures: 180 surgical cases. An 85% survival rate in a patient population where the baseline expectation was significantly lower. 153 children currently alive who had been given poor odds. Before characterizing an organization's finances in a professional setting, she said it was worth spending 10 minutes with the public data. That was fairly basic financial literacy. The table was quiet in the way tables get quiet when something unexpected has happened and no one has decided yet how to respond to it. Warren's face had gone through two colors. His mouth opened once closed and he reached for his wine glass without finding a reason to drink from it. He had been hit with his own instrument numbers documentation professional standard, and he had nothing to return with because everything she had said was verifiable, and he knew it. Daniel turned toward Claire. His jaw was tight. He said close to her ear that she was going to regret this. The lights in the ballroom went down slightly. A voice from the podium announced that the evening's program would be expanding. The National Pediatric Charity Award ceremony taking place in the Empire Room adjacent to the main ballroom was opening its doors to all gala guests. Anyone who wished to attend was welcome to proceed next door. Chairs began to scrape. People stood, picked up their drinks, and started moving. Daniel had spent 10 years making sure no one in that room took Claire seriously. She had dismantled it in about 90 seconds. He was already scanning the lobby through the ballroom doors looking for Robert Alcott. The crowd moved slowly through the lobby corridor, guests carrying their drinks and their conversations from the ballroom toward the Empire Room at the far end of the hall. Daniel was moving faster than the flow, working through gaps in the crowd with his eyes fixed on a point ahead. Robert Alcott was standing near the corridor's midpoint with two of his deputies finishing a conversation with someone Claire did not recognize. Daniel angled toward him and extended his hand from about 6 feet out, voice already warm and projected to carry. He said Alcott's name. He said he was glad to have the chance to connect before the program started. Robert Alcott stopped. He looked at Daniel's outstretched hand. Then he looked at Daniel's face, a look that took its time and found nothing in particular worth acknowledging. He turned and walked forward. His security moved in a single clean step and filled the space between them, not aggressively, not with any visible effort, the way a door closes. The deputies followed. The conversation resumed as if the interruption had not happened. Daniel stood with his arms still extended. 3 colleagues who had been close enough to see it located something interesting to look at on the floor. Warren Schiff came through the crowd with Diane on his arm, glanced at Daniel and shook his head once, not with sympathy. With the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just watched someone else's problem become more clearly their own problem. Daniel's arm came down. He turned and found Claire in the crowd, and his hand closed around her arm above the elbow the same way it had when they walked in. He pulled her sideways out of the main flow through a door marked staff access into the service corridor behind the ballroom wall. The corridor was dim lit by sconces spaced too far apart, lined with closed utility doors and the low electrical hum of kitchen equipment on the other side of the wall. He pushed her back against the wall and stood close enough that she could smell the bourbon from dinner. He told her what tomorrow looked like. She would pack 1 bag and leave the house before noon. The prenuptial agreement his lawyers had drafted was specific and thorough, and she would walk out with what she came in with, which was nothing. Her federal conviction was on her permanent record and would follow her into every background check she ever faced. She would be lucky to find steady work. He said this without volume, without drama, the way people deliver information they have already finished feeling about. Then he straightened his cuffs and walked back through the staff door into the light. Claire stayed in the corridor alone. The door swung shut behind him, and the only sound left was the low hum of the kitchen equipment through the wall. She did not move right away. She stood with her back against the wall and let the full weight of it arrive without trying to manage it, not just tonight. Not just the prenuptial agreement, or the public humiliation of being parked behind a column while Daniel kissed Jade's hand 10 feet away. All of it. The morning 10 years ago when she had walked into a federal building and told a story that was not hers to tell because she believed with every inch of the person she was then. That love required that kind of sacrifice. The drive down to FPC Alderson in West Virginia in a van that smelled like industrial cleaner, watching the highway give way to hills and thinking that Daniel would come. That he would find a way. That the lawyers he had promised would materialize into something real. They did not materialize. He did not come. Not once in 4 years. She remembered the laundry detail in January of her second year when the heating unit in the work building broke and they were told to continue their shift anyway. The cold came through the cinder block walls and settled into the small bones of the wrist and stayed there, a deep ache that the prison doctor addressed by telling her to keep moving. She kept moving. She kept moving for 4 years, and when she walked out through the facility gates with a paper bag and a supervised release agreement, there was a car waiting. Not Daniel. A car service he had arranged from Chicago because by then he was a vice president at Alcott Capital and had people who handled logistics. She pressed the back of her hand against her eye once. One tear quickly gone. And then there was the girl. The one she had not spoken about to anyone outside of that facility, not in 6 years of building Wings of Hope, not once. 22 years old, assigned to the bunk beside Claire's during the second winter. A heart condition that had been diagnosed years earlier and never properly managed. The kind that required one specific medication that the prison infirmary did not carry and apparently could not obtain quickly enough. The facility doctor was not a bad man. He had done what he could, which was not much, and he had told the girl's family that he was sorry, which was true, and which had not been enough either. Claire had sat with her through the last night. She had held her hand because there was nothing else to offer and because no one should have to leave the world without someone holding their hand. The hand was very light by then and very cold, and by morning there was nothing left to hold. She had made a promise in that room. Not out loud, not to anyone who could hear it. Just to the dark and to whatever remained after the girl was gone. If she got out, she was going to spend whatever was left of her life making sure that gap, the wrong place, the missing medication, the absence of anyone with the means to close the distance between what existed and what was needed, she was going to spend her life closing it. That promise had become Wings of Hope. Wings of Hope had become 500 children. 500 children had become Charlie Alcott on a medical transport to Munich with a surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning. Claire pulled in a slow breath, let it out, and stood straight. Tomorrow she would figure out where she was sleeping. Tonight she had her kids to go to. She pushed through the staff door and walked toward the Empire room. Through the open doors at the end of the hall she could already see the stage lights and the rows of velvet seats filling in. Renee was somewhere inside and the evening was not finished. The Empire room held several hundred seats arranged in a shallow amphitheater facing a wide stage, and by the time Claire found a place in the last row it was nearly full. Camera crews from 3 network affiliates had positioned their equipment along the side aisles. The stage lights were up and the house lights were low, and the effect was of a room that had organized itself around something that was about to matter. Daniel dropped into the seat beside her without speaking. Jade settled 2 seats down, already looking at her phone. The host came out and the room settled. He moved through the Foundation's history, without making it feel like a recitation. 6 years. More than 500 children. Surgical outcomes that had started appearing in cardiology journals as statistically improbable. The kind of numbers that made researchers look twice at the methodology because the results did not fit the expected range. Then he said he wanted to tell one story in particular. He told Charlie's story without using the family's last name, the diagnosis at 18 months, the assessment at Lurie Children's. The eventual consensus among 3 separate surgical teams that the case was beyond what could be done domestically. The Munich clinic had agreed to take him. The family had the resources. What they did not have due to a banking compliance hold that froze their accounts during the wire transfer window was the ability to move the money in time. The medical transport flight had a hard departure window. The fund was short. The founder had made up the difference herself, her personal savings and an antique locket that had belonged to her mother, pawned the same afternoon. The flight left on schedule. The surgery happened. Charlie was 5 years old. In the front row, Margaret Alcott had a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Robert Alcott sat with his hands folded in his lap and his jaw working slowly. When a camera swung toward him, he was still. When it moved away, he reached up once and wiped his face quickly, the gesture of a man not accustomed to being seen doing it. The host picked up the gold envelope from the podium and opened it without ceremony. He said, "The National Pediatric Charity Award goes to the founder and chief architect of Wings of Hope Foundation." He paused for exactly 1 beat. Claire Harmon. The name landed in the room, and the room took a moment to process it. Daniel did not move. He sat with the stillness of a man whose brain has received information it is refusing to route. Then slowly he turned his head to the left. Claire was sitting beside him. Same black dress. Same expression she had worn through dinner and through the lobby and through the service corridor. The spotlight swept the back rows and found her, and the room began to rise. She stood. She moved past Daniel's knees without looking at him and walked down the side aisle toward the stage. Renee was already at the bottom of the stairs, and when Claire reached her, Renee stopped pretending she was not crying and pulled her in with both arms. Claire held on for a moment, then stepped back, took the stairs, and walked to the center of the stage. The host offered her the microphone and stepped aside. Claire looked at the room for a moment before she spoke. When she did, her voice was level and unhurried and carried without effort. She said she was grateful for the recognition and that she was going to use the next few minutes to say something that was not in any press release the foundation had ever issued. She said she had entered a federal correctional facility 10 years ago voluntarily. Not because of a mistake she had made. Because someone she loved had made one, and she had believed with the particular blindness of a person who loved badly that taking his place was an act of devotion rather than an act of destruction. She pled guilty to wire fraud she had not committed. The judge gave her 4 years. She served them at a federal facility in West Virginia. She described what that meant in practical terms. The laundry detail in winter when the heat in the work building failed and the cold came through the walls and settled into the wrist joints and did not leave. The count at 5 in the morning standing in a line while an officer moved down the row with a flashlight. The way the weeks stopped having names and started having numbers instead, and how after enough time the numbers stopped meaning much either. The institutional rhythms that slowly replaced the memory of what ordinary life felt like until ordinary life became the thing that seemed abstract and the facility became the thing that felt permanent. And then she told them about the girl. She said, in my second year, there was a young woman assigned to the bunk beside mine. She was 22 years old. She had a congenital heart condition that had been diagnosed years before she arrived at that facility and never properly treated. The infirmary did not have what she needed. The doctor was not a bad man, I want to say that clearly. He did everything he was able to do. It was not enough. She stopped for a moment. The room was absolutely still. She said, I sat with her through the last night. I held her hand because it seemed like the only thing left that I could do. By morning she was gone. She was 22 years old, and she died because the right medication was not in the building and no one had the means or the authority to close that gap in time. She paused again. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but it carried something underneath the steadiness that the whole room could feel. She said, I made a promise that night. If I got out, I was going to spend whatever was left of my life making sure that what happened to her, the wrong place, the wrong moment, the absence of anyone with the resources to make the difference, I was going to make that gap smaller wherever I could. That is what Wings of Hope is. Not a resume line. Not a legacy project. A promise made in the dark to a 22-year-old girl who deserved better than she got. Margaret Alcott stood up. She did not raise her hand or wait to be acknowledged. She stood and her voice came out rough and direct across the quiet room. She said, you saved our Charlie. The words broke slightly on the last one. She said the doctors had given up. If it were not for what you built, we would not be here tonight. We owe you a debt we cannot repay. A man in the 4th row stood. He said the foundation had funded his daughter's surgery 2 years ago and that she was starting 3rd grade in the fall. A woman near the aisle stood and said her brother had walked out of a Munich clinic 14 months ago because of Wings of Hope and was coaching youth soccer now. Others rose one at a time at first, then in pairs and clusters, until most of the room was on its feet and the applause had become something sustained and physical that filled every corner of the space under the high ceiling. Claire waited. When the room began to settle, she looked toward the back row with the directness of someone who has known for hours exactly where a specific person is sitting. She said, the person whose crime I went to prison for is in this room tonight. She said his name. Daniel Harmon. She said he was her husband. She said that for 6 years after her release he had kept her in a storage room in their house in Winnetka and called it appropriate. That he had told her that morning to buy a dress with sleeves long enough to cover the scars on her wrists so his colleagues would not have to see them. That 40 minutes ago in a service corridor off this lobby he had told her she would leave tomorrow with one bag and nothing else because he had a prenuptial agreement designed to guarantee it. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, my debt is paid. Tonight I step out of the shadow. And tonight for the first time in 10 years I am completely free. The room came up again, and this time it did not settle quickly. The man who had spent a decade making her invisible had just watched an entire room stand up for her. There is no coming back from that. In the back row, Daniel sat with his hands on his knees and his face the color of old ash. Beside him, Jade had put her phone away. Neither of them looked at the other. The applause was still going when Daniel moved. He came down the side aisle fast, shouldering through the crowd the way people move when momentum is the only remaining strategy. His voice was pitched to carry over the noise. That is my wife, she built this, we did this together. And his arms were already open before he reached her. The full physical performance of a man who had just remembered he was proud of someone he loved. The cameras were right there. The timing was not coincidental. Claire watched him come. She did not step back or shift her weight or do anything that could be read as retreat. She simply looked at him, and something in that look, the complete absence of the reaction he needed, stopped him at about 4 feet. His arms stayed open in the air between them. He could not close the distance because closing it required her to receive him, and she was not going to do that, and some part of him understood this before the rest of him caught up. Jade had followed him through the crowd, red silk heels, positioning herself at the edge of the camera frame with the instinct of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about where the frame was. She straightened her shoulders and arranged her expression into something adjacent to dignity. Margaret Alcott came out of the crowd without hurrying. She placed herself between Daniel and Claire with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been managing rooms for 40 years and found this one relatively straightforward. She looked at Jade the way you look at something that has walked in through a door it had no business opening. She spoke at a volume calibrated for the nearest press photographers to catch every word, and what she said made 2 of them lower their cameras for a moment out of what appeared to be reflex. Then she turned her head and asked the nearest hotel staff to please call security. 2 men in dark suits arrived in under a minute. Professionals, unhurried, the kind of hotel security that works events where the guests include people who do not like scenes. They positioned themselves on either side of Jade with a courteous firmness that left no room for negotiation. Jade's composure lasted about 15 seconds into the escort. Then her heels lost purchase on the marble and she called Daniel's name in a register that carried across the room. Daniel was looking at the floor with the focused attention of a man studying a very interesting piece of marble. The doors at the far end of the lobby opened and closed and she was gone. Robert Alcott had been waiting. He came through the space the crowd had quietly opened for him and stopped in front of Daniel close enough that what he was about to say would not travel further than he intended. One of Alcott's security men made a small motion and the press stepped back a few feet. Alcott spoke quietly. He said his team had spent the previous week in the original case files. The forensic accounting report that had not made it into evidence 10 years ago. The black ledger records. The wire transfer history that told a different story than the plea agreement. He said, we know what you did. The documentation had been submitted to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois that afternoon. Daniel's accounts had been flagged for immediate freeze pending federal order. His building access to Alcott Capital had been revoked. His employment had been terminated, the paperwork signed an hour ago before Alcott had walked into the Palmer house. The merger contract was cancelled. And then Alcott said with the quiet of a man delivering a final line rather than opening a discussion, this time there is no one left to take the fall for you. He held Daniel's gaze for a moment, then looked away with the finality of a man who has finished with something and does not intend to return to it. He walked to Claire. He took her hand and bent over it briefly, not a social gesture, something older and more deliberate, the acknowledgement of a debt that money could not settle. Then he offered his arm to Margaret, and the 2 of them moved toward the exit and the crowd shifted to let them through. Daniel's legs went. Not in stages, they simply stopped holding him and he went down onto the marble floor and he reached out and got his fingers around the hem of Claire's dress. His voice came out wrong. He said her name and he said please and he said do not leave me. And he said tell them, as if there were still a version of events she could offer that would close what had opened tonight. Claire looked down at him. There was no triumph in it. There was something much more tired than triumph, the look of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing across a very long distance and has arrived finally at the place where they are allowed to put it down. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes, navigating the crowd with the practiced invisibility of good hotel staff. Claire reached out with her left hand. She worked the thin gold band off her finger. It had been there for 10 years, and it left a pale indentation in the skin underneath. She held it over the nearest flute for a moment. Then she opened her fingers. The ring dropped into the champagne and rang against the crystal as it sank, a small clear sound that several people nearby heard without being able to immediately identify it. She said, "My debt is paid. You are free. I am free. Goodbye." She took Renée's arm. They walked out through the lobby and into the cold October air, and the doors closed behind them and Daniel was still on the floor. 6 months later, Chicago was remembering how to be warm. Claire stood at the window of her office on the 12th floor of a building near Lincoln Park, a cup of tea in both hands, watching the city come back to itself after a long winter. The lake was sharp and blue in the distance. The trees along the park were showing the first real green of the season, the tentative kind that arrives before it fully commits. She had been standing there for a few minutes, not thinking about anything specific, which was itself new. There had not been many mornings in the past 10 years that did not begin with a calculation of some kind: what needed to be done, what needed to be hidden, what needed to be survived. The board had confirmed her as official president of Wings of Hope 4 weeks after the Gala unanimous no discussion required. The divorce had processed quietly in the months that followed. Daniel's attorneys had needed substantial retainers up front, and he had not been able to produce them, which meant the prenuptial agreement. He had spent considerable legal fees designing the one built specifically to ensure she left with nothing, had dissolved along with everything else he thought he owned. They separated with what each of them had started with. She kept the foundation. He kept the debt. René knocked and came in without waiting, which was how René had always operated. She said the car was downstairs. The Illinois Secretary of Health's office had confirmed. 3 network crews were already set up outside the new center on the north side. Today was the ribbon cutting for the Wings of Hope Pediatric Cardiac Center, a standalone facility fully funded by the foundation, 3 years in development, built on the north side of the city where it could serve the communities that needed it most. Claire had been working toward this specific morning from the desk in the storage room in Winnetka. On nights when the house was quiet and Daniel was elsewhere and she had 3 or 4 hours to do the work that actually mattered, she set down her tea, picked up her coat, and followed René to the elevator. That evening, after the ceremony and after the last of the press had cleared out, Claire found herself in the hallway of the new center's pediatric ward, moving slowly past the rooms. Most of the patients were young. This was a cardiac center. The cases were complex, and the children who ended up here had already been through more than children should have to go through. She stopped outside one room where a small boy was sitting cross-legged on his bed, constructing something ambitious out of a large pile of Legos and providing a running commentary on his engineering decisions to no one in particular. The surgical dressing was visible at the collar of his pajamas. He had not noticed her yet. She stood there for a moment without announcing herself, just watching him work. Marcus Webb found her there. He had been chief of pediatric cardiology at the center since its founding, and before that he had worked alongside René on several of the foundation's most complex cases, which was how he had learned, over a year ago, who Claire actually was. He had not said anything then. He had waited the way a person waits when they understand that someone is in the middle of something that needs to finish before anything new can begin. He came to stand beside her. They watched the boy through the window together for a moment. Then Marcus took both of her hands in his and he looked at the faint scarring along her right wrist, the mark left by years of laundry work in a federal facility, and he did not look away from it. He did not say anything that turned it into a wound that needed addressing. He just held her hands and looked at her and said he had known her story for over a year. He said he had waited until the storm passed because he wanted to ask when she was free rather than when she was still in the middle of surviving something. He asked if she would let him be her steadiness now. She said yes without hesitating. They left through the service exit at the back of the building into a late April evening that smelled of thawed ground and new leaves. And then, because Chicago does this on its own schedule and does not consult the calendar, it began to snow, large, unhurried flakes that fell slowly through the lamplight and dissolved the moment they touched the pavement, leaving nothing behind except the smell of cold, clean air and the sensation of something being quietly washed away. Claire stopped on the steps and looked up. A flake landed on her cheek and was gone before she could feel the cold of it. Marcus put his coat around her shoulders without being asked. He stood beside her and they stayed there for a moment without talking, watching the snow fall and melt and fall again. Across the city, in a rented room in Bridgeport on the 3rd floor of an old 3-flat, Daniel Harmon sat on the edge of a broken couch and waited for the television to warm up. He had found the room through a listing at the public library 6 months ago. The previous tenant had left the couch and a lamp and not much else. He had been working construction on the southwest side since January day labor cash at the end of the shift, a foreman who did not know his name and did not need to. His hands had gone from soft to blistered to calloused in the first 3 weeks. He was 47 years old, and he was more tired at the end of each day than he had ever been in his life. The television came on. The local news was running the ribbon cutting as the third story. The new wings of Hope Pediatric Cardiac Center, North Side Chicago. The camera found Claire at the entrance with the ceremonial scissors, Renee beside her, the Secretary of Health's representative somewhere in the background. Claire was laughing at something someone had just said, not a performed laugh, the real kind, the kind that arrives before you decide to have it. The scissors came down. The ribbon fell. The people around her applauded. The camera widened. Standing just to her left was a tall man in a dark coat, watching her with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who sees a person clearly and considers it a privilege. He was not performing anything for the cameras. He was just looking at her the way a person looks at something they intend to take care of. Daniel sat very still on the broken couch. He looked at his own hands resting on his knees. The skin was rough now, the knuckles scraped, the nails short and uneven. He looked at his hands for a long time. Then he looked back at the screen where Claire was still laughing in the April light outside the building she had built. He slid off the couch onto his knees on the old linoleum floor and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders moved with the particular heaviness of a man who has finally completely, and too late, understood the full dimensions of what he had thrown away. He had held a diamond in his hands for 10 years and spent the whole time trying to break it. Some reckonings arrive quietly. This one did not. Daniel threw away everything real he had in exchange for an image and lost both. If you had been in Claire's position that night at the Palmer house, would you have named him from the stage? Or would you have walked away in silence and let the truth find its own way to the surface? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you would have done.